here's the piece of brass tubing that I'm going to use as ornamentation for the output jack. Now, because the output jack itself fits so kind of closely to the walls, so you get a good shot of that, right? I don't want to run the risk of having shorts whenever the jack happens to wiggle a little bit or the guitar is plugged or unplugged. So to insulate the inside of the piece of brass tube, I have liquid electrical tape. So I'm going to paint the inside of this with that, and also the backs of the blades of the output jack, so that they are insulated from each other pretty securely. And then once actually the wiring up, I'll also coat these terminals here and a little bit of it as well, just in case, to be extra sure. So this stuff, if you've never used it before, it smells awful, and it comes with its own brush and a little can. I don't know what the solvent is. It might be acetone, but it is fairly loud. So I would recommend using this in a well-ventilated area. And it does take about 4 hours or so, I believe is what the can says, to dry completely. And it will take more than one coat to get a complete and thorough coverage. So, but the application process is fairly straightforward. You do want the surfaces to be clean, and I've already done that off camera. Okay. Now, obviously, first coat does not do a great job of sealing everything completely. As you can see, hopefully, there are still some shiny spots here and there. I may not show up on camera, but trust me, they're there, which is why a second coat will be necessary. Likewise with these guys, although I bet this will be a lot easier to show up on camera. Except that, unfortunately, the output jack has made a liar of me and has coated very nice and evenly. Oh well, c'est la vie. So, one of the things that I've been thinking about design-wise, going back and forth over, is what to do about a button cap for the boost button here. This is the control panel, already cut out. One of the things I consider doing is 3D printing it, but it's like, okay, it's not going to quite fit the same aesthetic as everything else. And then it kind of dawned on me. I have this strip of excess rosewood here that I trimmed off of the blank that I cut the fingerboard out of. And it is almost exactly big enough big enough around that I could possibly cut a button out of it. Now I do own a lathe, however this is small enough that I wouldn't be able to use a live center, which is the only attachment I have for my lathe. I don't actually have a chuck. So instead I'm going to try doing this kind of the cheating way that I've seen some people do, and actually do this on the drill press. So what I'm going to do is cut a fairly excessively long length of this, about this much or so, rough round it out with just a X-Acto knife, and then chuck it up in the drill press and turn and sand it down to a round dimension to make the button cap. At least that's the theory. Let's see how this goes. guys, so I ran into a bit of a problem. My little tube bending tool is really a tube kinking tool. Yeah, it does not work at all. And I went back and tried the trick that I saw several people on YouTube using, where they fill the tube full of sand and then manage to bend the tube that way. Yeah, no bueno, it did not work for me. Even tried heating the tube and doing the same thing, and all I got was just another kink. So, plan B. I visited my local, oddly enough, hydraulics fitting store, and they had a bunch of these, which are little compression fittings for brass tubing that happen to fit this diameter tube very nicely. Now, because I don't need a watertight seal or a fluid tight seal or any of that nonsense, I can completely dispense with these parts, basically the bolt and the little compression washer, and simply solder the tube directly into the fitting, like so. All right. That leaves me with the threads, which are not really part of the right aesthetic. So what I want to do with them is, using ye handy down the rotary tool and abrasive wheel, I'm going to sand the threads. Whoops, let me get this in the camera shot pretty good. Sand the threading off just like so, which will reduce the size of these just a little bit and make them fit a little snugger in the design. And then simply solder the tubing and like that. And that is going to be the aesthetic that we end up with. Okay, so since my tubing bender was nothing more than a tubing kinker, and I went to the route of using brass fittings like these, that I've sanded off the threads. That means that this design with this curved piping no longer works, so I had to do a little bit of rework. So now with this idea, and with this, so this design now has the brass fittings accounted for in these 4 places. Originally, the design had all 3 tubes coming out of the front of the control panel here and then wrapping this way. But because of the size of the fittings, that didn't really work. So instead, the tube which is going to have the bridge pickup leads in it is going to run this way, which in some ways is a little more natural looking, I suppose. Anyhow, to get to getting this all soldered up as straight as possible before I actually cut the channels in the guitar, I've machined out this jig for aligning the pieces. Now, of course, someone's going to look at this and obviously go, well, this is backwards. Well, yes, it is. This is actually upside down relative to the way that the pieces actually go in, and the reason for that is I wanted to do the soldering from the back as opposed to the front in case any of the solder ran a little bit, and so hopefully if there's any messy parts of it, that'll be on the back side and not quite as visible from the finished guitar, which is why this is done backwards. So I have I'm going to use a Dremel for cutting the tubing down to size. I found that it actually works better than trying to use a pipe cutter because of the size of the tube. So the rest of what I have here is torch, flux, fittings, tubing, and smaller gauge solder that I used for the other metalwork stuff. Hopefully this will give me a slightly neater job than I ended up with on the other pieces that I had to solder. So we'll see. Plus the other reason for using a PCMDF as a jig is if I end up scorching it, who cares? So yeah, here we go. Okay, so there we go. That worked out pretty well. And for obvious reasons, this is why I built a jig for it as opposed to trying to do this actually in the guitar body because of all the inevitable scorch marks. Yeah, so this is pretty warm to the touch, and I've left the ends of the tubes a bit long for the pickup switch cavity here and the pickup cavity there, but I can cut those off later once I do the actual fitting for sure, which is why these are a little long as well. So yeah, I've got a little bit of filing to do to clean up the couple of inevitable globs that of course always happens when you solder. But otherwise, I think this turned out pretty well. Let's see, are these pull? No, these are definitely not cool enough to pull out yet. But yeah, I think that will do the trick very nicely. Okay, so one of my problems is the brass is too shiny. It's new, I mean, obviously. It started to pick up a little bit of oxidation here and there just from handling with my fingerprints. Fingerprints and just other being machined around the shop. However, I do want to accelerate the aging process just a bit. It's just too shiny right now, so I'm going to fit the kind of older, grotty look that things are supposed to have for steampunk. So to hurry this process along, I have a little jug of this stuff, CLR. It is a mild acid of some sort that's designed for eating away rust, and all the advertised stuff. But because it is an acid, it will accelerate the oxidation process on the brass here. So this seems like a good time to go make lunch and come back in about an hour and see what I have. Hopefully some of the splotchiness and uneven kind of normal oxidation will be kind of the effect we get. I try to make sure that some areas were a little more deeply pooled than others, which hopefully will give me the effect that I'm after here. But we'll see. This may be a repeated type process thing where you have to do this more than once to get it to come out the way that I kind of want, so that everything kind of looks even as far as wear goes. So stay tuned. So it's been about 4 hours since I applied the CLR, and the pieces are starting to pick up a bit of a change of color, as we can see here. Obviously, as compared to the back, you can see, right, as compared to the original brass sheet here, there's a pretty substantial difference in the color of the pieces, especially in the recesses where the engraving bit has left more roughness and pockets. It's gotten quite a bit darker there. With this piece, you can see that the coloring is pretty uneven in places, which is exactly what we want. We want it to look natural, not uniform. So this batch of CLR has been sitting on the piece for several hours at this point, and given the way the chemistry works, at some point it is going to stop being effective. So I'm going to rinse the pieces off and apply another good coating, and then let these sit overnight and see what I have in the morning. So it is the same evening, not the next morning. My partner happened to come out and take a look at these in their current state, and her opinion was that no, I should clean them up now and stop the relicking, I guess is the right phrase, relicking process at this point, because in her opinion, with steampunk, the parts should look worn and old, not uncared for, which makes a lot of sense. I can kind of get behind that idea. So I'm going to go give these guys a quick rinse off to neutralize the CLR, and give them a quick wipe down and see what we get. Be right back. So there we are. Yeah, I think that'll work. I think that'll work rather nicely. Yeah, and here is part of the original brass sheet for comparison's sake. Pull this up where you can see just a hair better. So, pretty distinctive difference in shade and color there. So, let's get a close-up of this one. And the battery cover. Pickup selector cover. The output jack. Whoops. And the wiring channel tubes, or wiring tubes, I guess is the right phrase. Actually, this one goes that way relative to the guitar.